G'day, mate. Luke Ford here with my friend Richard. We're going to talk about substance addictions, process addictions. Can 12-step work help somebody get out of poverty? And my answer is yes. It made a dramatic difference in my life from my very first 12-step meeting relating to money. There are a lot of 12-step meetings, 12-step programs relating to money. There's Workaholics Anonymous, there's Underearners Anonymous, there's Financial Underearners Anonymous, there's Debtors Anonymous, there's Business Debtors Anonymous. So neither Richard or I are obviously speaking for any particular 12-step program. We're not representatives of the 12 steps. We're just people who are spiritual seekers who have found benefit from working the 12 steps. So for me, from my very first meeting, I got clarity. With clarity about the problem, I got strength. With clarity and strength, I got energy. With clarity, strength, and energy, I got inspiration. I immediately went out there, started looking for a better job. I immediately felt like I was at home, that I had a community. I bonded with people, and I got a sense of the program from my very first meeting. And I saw the program was simple, not easy, but simple and clear. And so I was excited. I started attending a meeting every day, if not in person, then over the phone. And my life started changing. My attitude changed right away. My therapist saw it. My body language changed. My thinking changed. The way I spoke changed. The way I carried myself changed. All from my very first few meetings. I saw a way out, because when I first got into 12-step programs relating to financial problems, I had over $50,000 in credit card debt. I'd never earned over $45,000 in a year. I was 49 years of age and going absolutely nowhere. So my opinion is 12-step programs can definitely turn around the poverty mindset and addiction to debting, to gambling, to under-earning, to underachieving. So Richard, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's a broad subject. I guess I can start with, I had a similar experience. My first 12-step meeting was Debtors Anonymous. That was 20 years ago. And I was $70,000 in credit card debt. And the experience I had going into that meeting the first time is that all of a sudden, all those dark fears and scary thoughts and things I didn't understand, and I guess the way I describe all these things that slithered around between my ears, all of a sudden the light was on them, and I said, "Oh, that's what that is. Oh, I understand. Oh, that's what that is. That's what that's all about." Because I heard people sharing their own experience, and it shed so much light on what I was experiencing that I'd never talked with anybody that way before. I'd never really had that kind of, clarity. Clarity is a great word. I think that is, for me, probably the single best word that's emerged out of my involvement with 12-step, is I get clear. I get clear on my money. I get clear on my time. I get clear on my feelings. I get clear on what's important. I get clear on what's not important, and where I want to spend my time. I literally didn't have a job, and within 2 weeks, I had probably one of the best jobs I'd ever had. It was great, and I started to earn in a prosperous way for the first time. Now, to be honest, I still had a lot of issues, but one thing that program taught me was clarity around, what happens when I use a credit card. Okay, I joke, I never met a credit card I didn't max out, and that's true. When I look back in the history, that's just what I do. Now, today I use debit cards, but I do not have what's called a credit card. I don't have unsecured lines of credit. I just don't have that. And that really works for me. I essentially pay cash for everything. And that makes a big difference in how I approach things. And so that's been one of the things that's emerged out of that. Probably 2 or 3 years into 12-step, my wife and I were making great money, but we weren't really handling it together in a disciplined way. That's taken a long time. That required growth on my part, growth on my wife's part, growth on how we relate to each other, and more importantly, how we relate to money. That's one of those things that takes time and practice, patience, and, frankly, a lot of love. You got to love yourself. You got to love the person in your life. You got to care about the people that you're working with, that you're being of service to. That that, in my experience, is where prosperity emerges from. Is from quality relationships. And prosperity is financial. I mean, being prosperous means you have the financial ability to do the things that need to be done, that you're solvent, you can take care of your bills, that you're prosper enough that you can take a vacation, or that you can, buy a new car if you want to, or, do the things that you need to do, and do that in a way that you're not striving for it, that you're just, enjoying the process. And I think that's something that in our culture we lose. People get all these kinds of things, but they're striving for it, they're chasing it, and they're not really enjoying the life that they're creating for themselves.
Yeah. So, what was your experience working the 12 steps? I'll share a little bit about mine first of all. So, working step one, I got a worksheet from my first sponsor, and there are about 50 questions to get clear about how debting and under-earning had wreaked damage in my life. And so when I went back and answered these questions, how debting and under-earning had affected my relationships, how it affected my relationships with my family, with my spiritual life, with my religious life, with my life in the community, with my professional life, with my health. When had I risked my life? When had I risked the lives of others with my reckless financial management? And how did I compensate for my history of under-earning and debting? That was so incredibly humbling and sobering when I just saw the depth and breadth and severity of my problems with regard to earning, with regard to debting, with regard to developing a career and getting along with other people. It was just, I walked away around in a low grade state of shock. So initially there was tremendous elation entering the program because I got clarity. I got names for what was ailing me. I recognized the symptoms. I was able to start recognizing the symptoms coming up in my daily life. There was euphoria. And by taking a little bit of direction at the beginning, my life immediately improved because I wasn't doing everything my own way. But then once I started working step one, I think we spent about a month on step one. I walked around in a little bit of shock. Then steps 2 and 3, there wasn't a lot of work with steps 2 and 3. That was, I believed in God. I pretty much always believed in God. Step 3 was a commitment to turn my life over to God. There wasn't a lot of work with regard to that. And then 4th step, doing the complete and thorough moral inventory, that was transformative because that was when I saw that this 12-step thing really works. So initially I went in agnostic about it, whether it would work or how much I believed in it. But I found as I worked the 4th step, as I got clarity about my resentments and came to see the role that I'd played in creating these problems that I had with other people, I found just working the 4th step, 80 to 90% of my resentment just melted away. And the 4th step was sobering, but it was also tremendously exciting. I started feeling a tremendous sense of freedom. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on the first few steps. How about your experience?
Well, I have a philosophy about the steps, and it's very much aligned with what the big book said. It says it's a new design for living. It's literally a framework that includes decision making, priority setting, time allocation, basic values, basic approach to relationships. It's all in there. It's in the steps and in the traditions. What my experience has been very incremental. In the big book, Bill Wilson talks about his story where he had this like mountaintop experience where there was this, he just had this complete psychic change that happened very suddenly and in a very big way, very profound and very obvious, kind of like on the, Saint Paul got struck struck by a light on the road to Damascus, and it completely changed everything. It completely changed the direction of his life. Bill Wilson had a similar, grand experience. It was just this immediate psychic change. That was not necessarily my experience in 12-step. It was gradual. It was a little piece at a time. And what I like to compare it to is learning to play a musical instrument. Now, when I first got my first guitar when I was very young, I knew 2 chords, and I played those 2 chords for 3 hours because I couldn't stop because I loved it so much. And 12-step has kind of followed a course for me that would be similar to the course that I followed learning to play an instrument. I learned those 2 chords, then I learned some more. Then I got a teacher, and the teacher taught me some more. Then, I got another teacher, and I learned some more. Then I started playing electric guitar. Then I learned some more. Then I had played in a band. Then I learned some more. And for me, it's a cumulative process. And I look at 12-step the same way. I think I've worked the steps. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say I've worked in 100 different ways. Some of those have been very short, very quick, just like literally in a day, because it can be done. You can literally take the steps in a day and actually have a psychic shift and actually have a change in the way you approach things and a change in the way you see yourself and other people. But what I've come to understand is that it's a lifestyle, and because it's a lifestyle, there are things that you do, and again, I do relate it to musical technique. You learn your scales, you get really good at that. You learn harmony, you get really good at that. But it doesn't all happen at once. You keep adding to your understanding of that. You keep adding to your capacity, and that's kind of the way I look at the steps. Now, most recently in my current program, I took about 2.5 years to work the steps completely with a sponsor, and I spent about 1.5 years on step 4, and I had resisted doing that, and it was just profound because it got down to the very deepest parts of my thinking. There's an idea. You'll hear this. Some people, you look at what you're aware of. There's this, and if it was as if it was a 360-degree pie, one slice of the pie is what you know. It's a very small slice. Then there's, things that that you don't know. Okay, that's another slice of the pie. But the biggest, in fact, the majority of the pie is all the stuff you don't know. And my experience is there's a lot of things about me that fit into that category that I only find out when I rub up against other people, when I rub up against life situations and start to understand what happens in those situations when I get resentment, when I get angry, when I get fearful. Then I start to understand what's really going on for me and going on in the context of that relationship. And what 12-step does for me is it gives me a reliable, clear, simple framework in which to interpret and deal with those things. And that's where the practice comes in. You practice that. You do it over and over again. And as you do it over and over again, you get better at it. Just to anchor with the idea of learning to play scales in a musical instrument. You start and you play them really slow, like da 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 da. Okay, and you do that till you master it. And you do it then you do it in every key. Then you get faster. Then instead of 1 octave, you do 2. Then instead of 2, you do 3. Pretty soon you're going, and it's very easy. You couldn't do that if you just tried to do it from the beginning. You have to slowly, steadily practice it and make it part of who you are. That's my philosophy about 12-step. And that's been and that comes right out of my experience because that's pretty much what I've done.
So on pages 83 and 84, it talks about the promises of what will happen if we diligently work the steps of the 12 steps. And it says, promise number 1, we are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. So yes. For me, I got I got started to get glimmerings of freedom from my compulsive thinking, from the cravings of the body and the obsessions of the mind. I remember from my very first 12-step meeting, I got a sense of sobriety. So I've never indulged in substances. So all my 12-step programs have been process addiction. So in my very first meeting, I was able to identify with what people were sharing and to have a sense of peace. And immediately afterwards, even my fantasies were tamer, were calmer. If I just kept going back to the meetings, my mind was slowly starting to get rewired. And then when I got a little bit of a break from the cravings of the body and the obsession of the mind, I did start to get glimmerings of a new freedom and a new happiness. But the deeper fulfillment of these promises came on the other side of step 9. So I got more upon completing step 4. I got release from my resentments. With step 9, after I made amends, started to clean up the wreckage of my past, then there truly was a sense of new freedom and a new happiness. And one of the advantages to this whole 12-step philosophy of calling addiction a disease, which to someone who's not a 12-stepper is going to sound crazy. Like a disease like cancer, really? Because you use a credit card too hard and too much and too recklessly, give me a break. But the advantage of relating to these process addictions or substance addictions as a disease is that you don't have to beat yourself up. You need to take accountability for the things you've done wrong and to repair the wreckage of the past. But you can also realize that you did the best you could with what you had at the time to meet your needs. So you don't have to degrade yourself anymore. You don't have to demean yourself anymore. You don't have to beat yourself up. Because I've had a lifetime of beating myself down, and that didn't really get me anywhere. So when I was able to release myself from beating myself down, then I started to get glimmerings of a new freedom and a new happiness. So do you have any thoughts on promise number 1? We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness.
Well, that's certainly been true for me. One of the things that I'm aware of most of the time is I have a different kind of confidence when I'm around other people, that I feel differently about them and about myself. And that's not something that's forced. I'm not trying to talk myself into that. That's just a natural response. And when I've made a lot of amends over the years, because it's an ongoing process. You don't just do it once and then you're done. Because there's things that are going to go up, you keep doing. But the beauty of that is that you take responsibility for your mistakes. Let other people take responsibility for theirs, so you're not taking more responsibility than belongs to you. And then you're free. And I'm thinking of one amends. I had someone that I was working with that I was very difficult with them. And I encountered them kind of unexpectedly. And I knew it was time to talk to them and make an amends. That I'm so sorry that I was so difficult with you, and I know how hard it was for you, and I appreciate so much. I value all of the things that you taught me, and that was completely sincere. And that's where, in fact, I was with this person. And what was interesting is they couldn't handle it. They literally, this person, they turned like white as a sheet, and it's like they just like wandered away. Just couldn't handle that. And the thing is, I don't know what was going on for them, and it wasn't communicated to me. And maybe I don't need to know. But what set me free is that I'm not hanging on to being angry at that person. I'm fully capable of receiving every good thing that they intended to give me, because people, for the most part, I think try to do things good, try to do good things for others. They try, but sometimes, and this is very much a 12-step issue, in that and in Al-Anon, uh, you try to fix things, you try to control things, you try to make things better, and of course, the harder you try to do that, the worse things get. Which is why they often say you didn't cause it, you can't cure it, and you can't control it, meaning that you can't do that. You're not capable of doing it. All any person can do is deal with what their part is. And so in that situation I just described previously, I became free of any guilt or remorse or shame I had about that situation by just saying, I value what the person was trying to do for me. And I felt that value. And I was able to feel it instead of feeling the anger or the resentment or the fear or the disappointment or, it should have been this way. How come it wasn't this way? You should have done this for me. Why didn't you do that for me? That gets in the way of all those good feelings. And it's the step work, in my experience, is what removes those things, so that when we sit down for step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, asking only for God's will for us and the power to carry that out, that we've done a lot of the work to remove all the things that get in the way of us doing that. And
Yeah.
that is a what's the song? There's a peaceful, easy feeling,
Yeah.
But I'm not trying to go on what that song and the implications of that are, because that's something specifically relational. But it does talk about acceptance. I kind of accept where things are, and that's a really profound anchor in 12 step, is accepting myself as I am, accepting other people as they are, accepting life on life's terms. And that's what the steps offer. Step one is the place where that begins. You give up that whole thing of, I have to fix it, I have to control it, I'm in charge of it, I got to make this happen. Give that up, because the sooner you give that up, the sooner you can understand where you fit, and the sooner you can have enough peace and humility to be able to do those things, which you wouldn't do otherwise, because you're trying to do it your way.
Yeah, when I was growing up as a preacher's kid, and so as a Seventh-day Adventist, and there was a lot of rhetoric about you need to turn your life over to God, and I never really had any interest in that. I wanted to do my own thing, which was going to be awesome, and I didn't really want to give my life away to God. I wanted to control my own destiny. I wasn't so immature and weak that I needed to turn my life over to God. Then as I did my own thing, it didn't turn out so well. So then I became really religious, and I got a temporary reprieve from my addictions for about a year or two, and then they just came roaring back. So no matter how much religious observance, no matter how many times I went to synagogue, no matter how much the dramatic religious change that I made, no matter how much I studied the Torah, it didn't make any difference with my addictions. So a lot of religious people would say, oh, you just need to practice your religion. But from what I've seen, just practicing your religion, from what I've seen, it does not affect people's addictions. It may change how they manifest themselves, but there's something about the para-spirituality of the 12-step approach, of the community and fellowship, where people share their stories, where you get to share your story, where there's community, fellowship, friendship, and tools and a process and a whole spiritual program that seems to transform people's character and transform people's addictions in a way that I don't tend to see with simply making a religious change. From my experience, making a religious change is similar to making a professional change or a geographic change. It does not get at the root of an addiction. And the root of addiction, in my understanding, Richard, is a lack of ease with oneself, a lack of ease with other people, and a lack of ease with God and the universe. Do you have any thoughts?
I have probably too many thoughts about that. But this whole idea of surrendering is hard for people. It's hard for me. There are days where it's still a little hard for me, where I have to do it by rote. I've done a little bit of research about why people behave the way that they do, and that's taken me into evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, and some other things. And part of the 12-step approach in the 4-step is to look at how our survival instincts respond. And when we look at a resentment, we look at what happened. We look at the person, what happened with that person, then what instinct it threatened. And see, that's a very deep behavioral thing, because those instincts operate unconsciously. They're not conscious. When you perceive something as a threat, you respond immediately. You respond as if your life was at stake. And one of the insidious elements of addiction is that we co-opt that mechanism, which is intended for our survival, and we defend ourselves against things we actually need, or against people that will actually help us. But we're doing that because we think it will promote our survival, because we think we're protecting ourselves. You know, and that happens unconsciously, and you have to get deep down to the root of that. And until you do, and literally retrain that, response reward system, your survival mechanism, your limbic system. That's really what we're dealing with. Until you retrain that, and 12-step is the best practicum for that I have ever seen. I have a lot of religious experience too. And, when you think in your head, I have to behave this way, that's fine. You can do that, but you won't be able to do it indefinitely, because somewhere along the line, you're going to encounter things that cause you to behave differently, and in some cases, with an addict, destructively. And no amount of thinking is going to change that. What has to change is your thinking from the very root. Bill W says, change me root and branch. So, you have to go down to the roots of where all this stuff is. And that's what 12-step is good at. That's my experience. And I'm not going to say this in an overly critical way, but my experience in a lot of my church experience is it's very superficial. They don't go into depth. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who visited her mother-in-law in Costa Rica, who's 95 years old, and she's going through some very difficult things with dementia. But one of the characteristics she's having, one of the things she's doing, is she's saying these things. She's saying what she thought about people. She's saying all these terrible things. Now, the interesting point of the reason I'm mentioning that is that my suspicion is those things for her were always there, and they got in the way of how she behaved, but she never dealt with them. They never came up. She never brought them to the surface to see them and go, okay, that's how I felt about this, but how does that really line up with reality? How does that really line up with what's going to build a good relationship with the people around me? How is that going to make me better at my job? How is this going to make me happier? And part of the deficit in a lot of religious practice, you're trying to change the behavior from the outside. Just don't do this, just don't do that, or do this or do that. You have a set of rules. One guy says, I don't smoke, and I don't chew, and I don't go with girls that do. That kind of mentality. That's great, but it doesn't produce the kind of depth and compassion and connection with a higher power that's really needed to have that peace in your spirit that endures even in difficult situations. It doesn't produce that. That has to come from all the way from the bottom of your soul all the way up, and that takes time. You have to literally retrain the way you think. You also almost have to retrain your emotional responses, which, part of that is psychological, part of that is instinctual, There's levels to that, and it takes time, and it's hard work. And the truth is, especially in our busy culture, we have this impression that we don't have the time to do that hard work. I would argue that by doing that hard work, your life will become so much easier. You'll have more time than you ever had. And that's
Yeah.
been my experience. And that's been my experience, by the way. I'm not spending time fixing problems that I created. I'm just doing the things that are put in front of me and doing them to the best of my ability and asking for help when I need it. And boy, that's a great way to live.
Yeah, I had the sense that I was just going around and around in circles, that no matter what program prior to 12-step, what program or self-help approach or religion or professional change or geographic change or change of my social circle, I just felt like I was just going around and around in circles. I was never gaining traction until I started to do this work. And there's a famous book called The Varieties of the Religious Experience, Study in Human Nature by the late William James. And there are, of course, many varieties of the recovery experience too. So for Dr. Bob, he met Bill W. one evening, and then the next day, Dr. Bob went in, he did a surgery while a little intoxicated, and then he spent the rest of the day going around the town making amends. So he didn't type out his amends on a 3x5 card for each amends. He didn't run each amends by his sponsor. There was no idea of sponsorship at the time. He just spent the whole day going around the town trying to clean up the wreckage of his past. And it seemed like Dr. Bob had a revolutionary change of mind in about a 24-hour period. And as with Bill W., it was also very fast, profound, dramatic change. And for other people, it takes months and years.
Well, I think there are different areas, and I'll kind of share for myself what it's been for me. For me, I did have a substance addiction. I enjoyed marijuana very much, in fact, too much. And my habit was to smoke all day, every day. And that ended my first marriage and started to edge its way into my dating and my second marriage. And then we visited a church, and I went to that church and I was high, and I left that church, and I've never gotten high since. I left that service. We continued to go to the church, but I was literally, that never happened again. I never did it again. Every once in a while I might think about it, but I know better than to dwell on that thought. But other things have required a completely different effort, have required a different approach. When it came to money, I had to unpack all of my thoughts and ideas about money. I had to unpack the ideas that when I asked my parents about money and they said, "It's none of your business," well, I took them literally. I went, okay, I don't have to worry about money. And of course, I started working for my dad when I was 10, and I made money. And of course, my first experience with money was, okay, I get this money and I get to save it, and I get to do whatever I want with it. And that idea about money carried over well into my 40s. And of course, because I never sat down and really thought about why I would think, I never even recognized that that's how I was addressing it. And so the understanding of that yielded from my 12-step work. It was the yield of my 12-step work, of asking those questions, of having other people ask me those questions. That took a long time. Other things didn't. When I first went into 12-step rooms, I stopped debting. I got a job and I stopped debting. I didn't do it. Got rid of my credit cards. Didn't do any of that. I had a relapse, so I know what that's like, and that's how I know I never met a credit card I didn't max out, because I did. Even when I was in program, I had a relapse, and because I really hadn't dealt with all of my thinking that related to that. But what I had in 12-step was a community that surrounded me who was dedicated to to their own as well as my transformational experience. In other words, they're dedicated to my recovery. They're dedicated to their own recovery. And just to go back to the church setting, again, I'm not saying this to be critical. It's just being pragmatic about my experience. I didn't have that kind of experience at that deep a personal level in those settings. I've only really had that kind of deep transformational work occur in 12-step rooms because that's their reason for being there. That's their primary purpose, is recovery. And that's the beauty of it.
Now, a lot of people, particularly new to 12-step work, say, I don't know about getting a sponsor, man. I've got trust issues. Well, of course, you've got trust issues if you're joining a 12-step program because you're not at ease with yourself, with other people, and with God. So my thought is a sponsor doesn't tell you what to do. Doesn't give you commands. So a lot of people, that's their misconception about a sponsor. To my understanding of sponsors, it's someone who's a tour guide to the 12 steps, and they give you assignments to work the 12 steps, to understand the 12 steps. But a sponsor does not tell you, or should not tell you, you should not date such and such a person, you should quit this job, you should stop speaking to your parents, or you must call your mother. A sponsor, in my understanding of sponsorship, does not give commands. A sponsor is a tour guide to the 12 steps, and so you don't have to be frightened of getting a sponsor. And also, a sponsor should not automatically assume that they get an all-access pass to your life. There may indeed be things that you don't want to talk about with your sponsor that you can talk about with someone else in a program. So those are some misconceptions in my mind about sponsorship that keeps many people from seeking out and taking on a sponsor. Do you have any thoughts for people who have trust issues, who are very leery about getting a sponsor?
Yeah. First of all, I'm going to agree with what you said. The role of being a sponsor is, you've been in 12-step, and 12-step is a toolkit. It's a toolkit for living. It's a design for living, but there's tools within that design and that you learn how to use. And so the role of a sponsor is to teach somebody how to use those tools. This is exactly what it says in the big book. You lay out the tools before them, tell them how you use them, show them how you use them, and help them to learn how to use them themselves. And the role of a sponsor is to teach someone how to use the tools, is to teach someone how to take the steps, is to teach someone by their own experience how to live the traditions, for example. So yeah, authoritarian sponsors, I mean, I know that there's some people who think that's good, and I think that there are seasons perhaps where that can be helpful, but that's certainly not my style when I sponsor people. Um, People have to make their own decisions. It's their recovery. They're responsible for their recovery. If they don't want to recover, I don't have to sponsor them. I'm not going to go chasing after somebody. I even discourage my sponsees from calling me to check in about things, to ask my advice. So I really don't give advice. The only thing I would do is try to direct them back to the God of their understanding, because that's the one who's in charge of their life. That's the whole point of 12-step, is you turn your will and your life over to the care of God. And so as a sponsor, that's exactly what I want someone to learn to do. That's what they need to learn to do. They don't need to trust me. I'm not their high. Well, they do need to trust me. They need to trust that I care enough about their recovery to guide them in learning how to take the steps, learning how to use those steps as tools for a more productive, more full, more, beautiful life. That trust gets earned, of course. So for people who have trust issues about that, of course, I'd ask the question, how trustworthy are you?
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and just maybe, just you might want to consider that maybe there's a little projection there.
Yeah.
You know, maybe. But no, there are some. I have heard of some legitimate abuses. I really have. I've heard of people trading sponsorship for sexual favors. I've heard that.
Oh, yeah.
And now I've never had that experience. I've never been around somebody who has done that, but I know that in the 12-step community worldwide, those kinds of things have happened. It's completely inappropriate, completely wrong. And you know, um, a sponsor with the right attitude, you're trusting your sponsor to be committed to their recovery and to your recovery, and nothing more. And if there's something more going on, you don't have to stick around for that.
So I've started taking on sponsees in one program, and a question I get from a lot of sponsees is, what do you want from me? What do you expect from me? And I would either answer nothing, or I expect you to do the work, to show up on time for our appointments, to talk. Those are the only things that as I understand it, I want from my sponsees. Now, what I get from sponsoring is that I get spiritual energy, I get inspiration, I get passion and excitement for the program. I get to see the program through new eyes. But if a sponsee asks you, Richard, what do you want from me? What are you looking to get out of this relationship? What do you say?
I sponsor people to improve my own recovery, because if I don't give away what I've been given, I don't get to keep it. And I mean, that's a very that's kind of a platitude, and I've heard that, and I know that that's true. I want to expand on that just a little bit. When I'm working with a sponsee, I'm getting deeper step work on my own, because in hearing their experience and hearing what they go through or what they're encountering, I learn more about
I often learn more about myself in that process. I've had that experience. It's almost like a guilty pleasure. It's like sometimes when I'm sponsoring somebody, the conversations I will have with them are so not me. It's like I'm channeling something. It's like something's coming through me to them. And I've learned to try to get out of the way of that. But part of the experience is listening very carefully to that, because it may very well be that the God of my understanding and the God of their understanding are talking to both of us at the same time. And that's where I want to be. And so that's one of the main reasons I sponsor. Now, in terms of expectations, I do, have a certain set of ground rules. I ask my sponsees to sign a contract. And I know that may sound a bit extreme. It may sound, my sponsor did that with me, and I thought about it, and I said, okay, I'm going to make this commitment to do this work. And it really wasn't, it was a commitment to my recovery. It was a commitment to show up for the recovery, work the steps. After I finish working the steps, sponsor other people, follow good orderly direction when given. And, when I got to the 4th step, don't tuck tail and run when it gets too hard. That was basically the outline of that. And my experience of that was, I found it valuable when I had that moment where I was in resistance. And believe me, when you're dealing with this stuff, resistance is going to come up. When you're in a 12-step meeting, or when you're working with your sponsor, your disease is in the next room doing push-ups, getting ready to come at you. And so resistance shows up in a variety of ways. But when I have a clear, back to clarity, when I have a clear understanding of what's expected, that clear understanding moved a lot of those potential problems out of my way. In other words, I made this commitment, so that's where I'm going. That's the direction I'm headed. It served me really well. And the people I sponsor, I've asked them to do that. And I think it promotes a good, healthy relationship when you have boundaries, when you have guidelines that are clear, so that there's, no guesswork about that. There's no guesswork about what's expected, no guesswork about what you're there. And, I had one situation with a guy that I was sponsoring, and he just wasn't doing the work. And I said, well, look, you agreed to this work. This is what you said. And so what I was able to say to him, I didn't fire him. I hear people talk about that. I fired my sponsor, or I fired a sponsee. So I said, look, I agreed to do this. Here's what I agreed to do, and I've done that. Here's what you agreed to do, and you didn't do it. When you're ready to do that, I'll be here. And so it's completely on them. I'm not trying to get them to do anything. I'm just saying, here's what I'm going to do. Here's what you agreed to do in the context of this relationship. And if you want to do it, I'm all here. I'm all in 100%. And if you don't, fine. I can't make you. It's not my job to make you.
And how much work do you put into your recovery, to attending 12-step meetings, to sponsor? I mean, you could just infinitely expand how much time you put into 12-step recovery, 12-step service, into sponsorship and the like. So what kind of boundaries do you set for yourself as far as your time commitment? I'll just give my answer.
Sure.
I keep mine to usually 10 to 15 hours a week. That's total attending meetings, talking to my sponsor, talking to my sponsees. So somewhere around 15 hours a week is the maximum. And I usually take weekends off, and I have set time periods during the day. It's basically only in the morning where I'm available for outreach calls. So how do you handle that?
It's very similar. I usually, I have 3 sponsees. I spend an hour a week with each of them. I often moderate meetings. I do a fair amount of service. I'm a GSR for one of my meetings, and I'm involved with that.
Explain what a GSR is.
It's the General Service Representative. I'm sorry, I'm a little jargony there. What a general service representative does is he represents an individual meeting to the conference of the fellowship as a whole. And what that does is it brings the meeting concerns to a place where the fellowship as a whole can discuss those things that are relevant to the fellowship. Now, most 12-step fellowships are by and large nonprofit corporations. And so they have a business aspect to that, and they have a spiritual aspect to it. And the conference deals with both of those. So they deal with the ongoing business, they deal with the spiritual issues, they deal with the meeting issues, and so on. So that's what a GSR does. And I've always found that being of service in that way has been very helpful for my recovery, because one of the things that we get to do is, the hardest part about doing that is being with other people who have the same, 12-step issue that you have. So you have to grow. It forces you to grow. It forces you to deal with other people's behavior through your recovery and not through your selfishness. And I found that to be a very powerful tool for me. I also, I group all of my spiritual practice together, and they have, they have different components. I do have, I vigorously attend church. I have things that I do with that. There are things I do from private meditation. So all of those things together form my spiritual practice. And that probably is about 15, sometimes 20 hours a week, but that's about that. But I try to keep it to that, because if I start doing more, then I'm getting addicted to 12-step programs.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to get overextended. So I heard this great great saying about AA, that an AA meeting is filled with sex addicts who don't drink anymore. So I've noticed this fairly familiar trajectory that people tend to start out in a substance abuse program like AA or NA, Narcotics Anonymous. Then they get their sex and love life under control with a 12-step program related to that, of which there are about a dozen. And then often they move on to Debtors Anonymous or some money-related program. And they might throw in a food program if they have a problem there, or Al-Anon, which is the kind of the sister program to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's for people who have supported or fallen into relationships with alcoholics. That's the specific meaning, but the general meaning is that it's for people who have sick people in their life, and everybody's got sick people in their life. So I've often heard it said that Al-Anon's the best program for learning to get along with other people. So it's rare that you'll find someone in any of these programs who's just in one program. There does seem, however, to be a fairly familiar trajectory. Starts off with substance abuse recovery, and then people they compensate because they can no longer act out with drugs or alcohol, so they often tend to act out with sex. So that tends to be the next program that they get sobriety in. And then when they can no longer act out with drugs, sex, or alcohol, then they'll often act out with food or with gambling or social media addiction or debting, and so the dance continues. Do you have any thoughts on anything I just mentioned?
Well, this is actually something that I'm very interested in and very engaged in. You know, in my faith tradition, we use a word. The word is repentance. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about what that word means. And another word is righteousness, but I'm just going to deal with, I'm sorry about that.
It's fine.
Having some technical difficulties here. Is everything okay?
Yep, yeah. Everything's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. Anyway. The real understanding of what repentance is changing the way you think. Now, to follow the trajectory that you described, someone's drinking alcohol. Well, it's pretty obvious that getting drunk every night to the point where, you know, you black out, it's going to have negative consequences. And when you stop doing that, that's a good thing. So you're stopping a behavior. You know, and when people hear the word repentance, they think it means don't do bad things anymore. Don't steal, don't lie, don't sleep with your neighbor's wife, don't do those things. And that's true. I don't want to take away from that. But there's a whole world of thought and experience and emotion that underlies that. That's why when people, you know, stop one addiction, why they go immediately to the next, because their thinking has not changed.
Yeah.
How they approach life has not changed. They just stopped doing this one thing. You know, it's like a tree is growing over the fence. Okay, wait, you cut the branch that's going over the fence. Great, it's done. No, but there's that tree, and it's still growing, and it's going to grow back over that fence, and it's going to grow over other fences before too long. You've got to go to the root of that tree and go, this has got to come out. That takes a high degree of willingness, and sometimes it takes years. You know, to me, recovery is best expressed in decades, not days or months. And I don't want to take away from those, you know, intense experiences where, you know, all of a sudden we get that psychic change and things shift, and we have this wonderful euphoric experience that things are really great. I don't want to take away from that, because those things are necessary, they're useful, and they're helpful. You know, the way I see recovery, it's a direction that I'm headed in. In other words, I can go one of two directions in a recovery context. Either I can go towards my recovery, or I can go toward my disease. There's no in between. I'm going one way or the other, and what determines that is my thinking. So the things that I do, like okay, if I didn't do drugs, I could turn around and do movies. And I actually had the experience some years back. I smoked cigars for quite some time, which I enjoyed very much. But I started to notice something. This looks a lot like what I used to do when I got high on smoking pot. I could see the behavioral connections to that. It seemed like I was doing the same thing. It wasn't as destructive. I was doing much more productive things with my life, but it was still limiting me from being, to steal from the Marine Corps or Army, be all you can be. See, I think that's what recovery is partly about, being all we can be, all we're capable of building, but it's more than that. It's actually expanding and building that capacity, because we approach things in a healthy way. We have better relationships. That makes more things possible. We have a better relationship with ourselves. We see ourselves differently. So we're not spending so much effort and time and energy being angry at ourselves. That takes a huge amount of energy to do that. It takes a lot of energy to be angry. And I don't have enough energy to be angry. I don't have enough time to do that. But I've had to retrain myself to not do that. And that takes time. And it takes willingness to make that commitment long term. And somehow, on some level, you have to believe that that's going to work. And I think to me that's the beauty of 12-step room, because you see people for whom it works, and you can talk to them and ask them how they did it, and they're happy to share that with you. Much more so than you'll find in necessarily in business settings. But I mean, you can find people who find business mentors and do that. I'm not suggesting that doesn't happen or can't happen. But I think it's more the norm in those kind of rooms, in our 12-step rooms, than it is in life in general. It's just a perception. And I want to be careful about making too strenuous an assertion about that, because I'm sure there are plenty of places where things work just great.
You mentioned that you took 18 months to work step 4 in a particular program. What were you doing for 18 months on step 4?
I was doing a considerable amount of writing. There was 180 questions. And, as I would write, my sponsor encouraged me to write more. And it was extremely helpful. It was a lot of work. But again, it comes back to, I was at a point where I really wanted to get to the bottom of my thought life. I really wanted to have access to the deeper layers of my thought that I hadn't had access to before. And that took time. And, some people do it quicker. That's okay. That's how long it took me. I'm not suggesting it should take 18 months. I'm just saying I chose to spend 18 months on that. And I am really glad that I did, because it profoundly changed the way I see myself, the way I see other people, and the way I see life. And I had already had quite a bit of that to begin with, but I had a whole other level that it had not been accessible to me before, because I chose to do that. And of course, that was a long time into that. That was, I finished that a couple of years ago. So that was after having been in 12-step for a long time. And I had resisted doing that. It had been presented to me numerous times, and I'd resisted it, didn't want to do it. And I would say I wasn't ready to do it. When I did it, was the perfect time. I'll give you one example. There was a question that said, talk about your early religious experience. And I just said, what a stupid question. I mean, what are your early remembrance about religious experience? And I got angry at the question. Now, I answered it, but I want to give a little background to that. Prior to that, for a couple of months, in my meditation time, I would have my higher power, God would ask me, do you trust me? Sounds like a simple question. It says, well, of course I trust you. I go to church. I read the Bible. I do all these things. Of course I trust you. The question kept coming. Do you trust me? The question became very irritating. And literally, it was like every time I would sit down to meditate, I would get that same sense and that same question. And I would encounter the same resistance on my part. Well, of course. And I had all these answers and all these excuses and everything else. Okay. And then along comes this question. Talk about your early religious experience. And as I wrote about that, I realized something. That the household I grew up in, it was a Jewish household. And we went to temple. But for my parents, it had no spiritual significance whatsoever. They had no spiritual understanding of any observable way from what I understand today would be a spiritual experience. They weren't pursuing it for that reason. They were pursuing it because we're Jewish and this is what we do. And I would ask them, why do you do this? Because we're Jewish. It's not really an answer, but I think it was the answer for them. And what I realized from that is the idea of trusting an unseen, universal spiritual being for their life and their well-being was a completely foreign concept to them. Not only did they not live it, they never thought to even consider it. I pickled in that emotional language for 18 years. And so what I discovered in the context of doing that writing and all of that process was I didn't trust God. I kept getting that question because there was this very deep response of, when the going gets tough, I'm still going to take it over myself. And I have all these rationalizations that surround it. So it doesn't look like that. So it looks religious. So it looks all this and it looks all that. Bottom line, it wasn't. Bottom line, I wasn't trusting. I wasn't trusting God at all. At certain points I would, but at certain crucial points I would not. And it was only through that process, and it was multi-tiered. It wasn't all one thing. It was a combination of being committed, going in that direction, taking time in prayer and meditation, getting that question, being frustrated by that question, then and I'm sure it was being dredged up as I was doing some of this other, writing work, because this was in the context of all that, deep self-examination. And then all of a sudden this thing just, at that moment when I answered that question and I let go of my resistance, I really came face to face with who I really was. And I had a lot of those experiences. It wasn't just that one, but that I went to, at some length to describe it, because that's what happened. And that completely changed the way I approached that, and the level of trust I had in God to provide what I need, in God to be trustworthy, and that I can turn my life over on a deeper level, in a greater way than I ever had before. And that's that. To me, I think that's an ongoing process, but that came right out of that diligent, thorough, and this is my sponsor encouraged me, you really want to be thorough with this. You really want to be thorough with this. And he encouraged me to do it, and I have no regrets. I would never go back. I would never do it. I would never look back at it and go, gee, I wasted my time. No, it changed everything about the way I think.
So Herb Cade teaches a year-long seminar in the 12 Steps, weekly meeting that goes about 2 hours, and he divides it up. He spends about 4 months on step 1. He spends about 4 months on step 4, and then he spends 4 months on the other 10 steps. How do you typically divide up the time that you spend walking a sponsee through the 12 steps, and how long does it typically take?
I've taken people through the steps in a week. I have the sponsees I'm working with now. I'm kind of taking them along the same course that I did recently, which is the long version. But I do both. I'm part of a basic recovery meeting where we take all 12 steps in 4 1-hour sessions. You can do that, and it can really make a difference. And that there's a lot of historical documentation that that's what early 12-step people did. In fact, one of the things we do is we use that same inventory sheet that Dr. Bob used. And he would take the people through an inventory in about an hour. It's like a snapshot of who you are and where you are. What you're looking at, your grudge list, looking at all the resentments you're carrying, and looking at that and looking at, what's really going on with that. You can do that in an hour. And have a significant psychic change in how you see yourself and how you see life. I've watched it happen with people over and over. So there's no one way that I do that. I think different things are appropriate for different seasons in a person's life. If that makes any sense.
Sure. So when you take them the long way, how long does that typically take?
Well, I have one individual, he's on his 9th step now. He'll be done in about another month. And that's been 2 years.
So one of the things that fueled me throughout my life was resentment, and it fueled me, but it also poisoned me. I'm like those industrial towns in the Midwest where they have one manufacturing plant that feeds everyone in town, that supports everyone in town, but it simultaneously spews out poisonous chemicals that kills a large percentage of people in town very early. It poisons the water, poisons the air, poisons the lake, poisons the environment, and it also feeds everyone. So that's akin to how resentment has played a role in my life. So through 12-step, I had to find a power and an energy to replace the role that resentment and anger had played for me. So I got energy through clarity. I got passion through clarity. I got energy through community. I got energy through structure. I got energy through good orderly direction. I got energy through forming bonds with people. I got energy through inspiring talks in the program and inspiring literature. So I had to tap into a power greater than myself. I had to tap into sources of energy to replace the toxic forms of energy that I'd been relying on, anger and resentment. So where did you find the power? Where did you find the energy in your journey to recovery?
I find it in the soundness of my relationships. And, in my younger days when I was not recovered, when I was operating on self-will and my disease, it was kind of like a big flamethrower, moving things out. And, yes, getting it done, but yes, doing a lot of destruction in the course. I experience my energy differently. I have more energy now than I think I've ever had. But it's a little bit like a welding torch. It's this very fine, very controlled, very hot blue flame. You almost barely don't even notice. But you have to know how to manage that and how to utilize that. But that's more of what my experience is like. Being something of an extrovert, I derive energy from interacting with people. And the more positive my interactions are, the more security I have to be free to create, to be free to interact, to be free to do things. Whereas in the past, when I was angry and resentful, it damaged my relationships and actually sapped my energy. It wasn't a source of energy. It was actually sapping my energy. That was my experience. Resentment is the poison I drink, hoping the other guy is going to die. Hoping the guy I'm angry at is going to die. I'm the one who's dying. I'm the one who's getting killed. Because it literally takes so much energy to be angry in an inappropriate way. Now, anger is appropriate. Anger can be an indication that something is wrong. And so, there are times when you get angry at things and it points the way that something needs to be dealt with. But my experience of that kind of anger is that it's very brief. It gets my attention. And then I settle into this place of acceptance. And in that place of acceptance, my energy doesn't come from me. It comes from my higher power and the quality of the relationships around me. And sometimes the energy doesn't have to come from me. It has to come from that shared experience, or the idea that many hands make light work, where other people are helping me. I get into that kind of a flow. I can do way more with the help of other people than I can on my own. Way more.
It's fairly common that one partner will get into recovery while the other partner does not see the need for it. That can really challenge a relationship. Do you have any experience, strength, or hope on that topic?
Well, both my wife and I are in 12-step, and I'm kind of 4 years ahead. I went into program about 4 years before she got into program. So the recognition that 12-step is something important, is something we share on each other's behalf. And even when I first started, there was no resistance. My wife's mother, who was a mean drunk, in the last few years of her life was in 12-step. So I think my wife had a really positive association with 12-step to begin with. So when I went in there, there was no resistance. She was happy that I was doing it. So I don't have direct experience with having a resistant partner or spouse in that regard. I've talked to people who have, and that's not uncommon. But my recovery is for me. If someone can't or doesn't think it's a good thing, the less I discuss it with them, probably the better. And the more I can allow my recovery to influence the relationship. Now, I did have a situation with my mom, who was an active alcoholic. And I the last few years of her life, I moved into her house and I took care of her. And I did not try to get her to change. She thought my feelings were BS. No, she did. She did. She said, and she said it more forcefully than that.
Yes, I can sense that.
And I just went, okay, well, there's some things I'm just not going to share with her. There are just some things I'm not going to share with her because she can't handle it. You don't go to the hardware store for orange juice, because if you do, you're going to waste your time. You're not going to get the orange juice you need, and you're just going to get upset that they didn't have it. What's the point? And I mean, you can reverse that around. The farmers would tend to say, "You can't change a pig; it won't work, and it just upsets the pig." And a little bit of farmer wisdom there, but the truth of that is, other people are going to do what they're going to do. If I have a problem with someone else's behavior, it's my problem. So if I have someone, If I'm in recovery and someone doesn't like my recovery, well, okay, do I like my recovery? Fine, then I'm going to do that. And I'm going to learn how to express it to them in a way that they can receive. Or not. And if they don't, then they don't. And it's not required of them that they do. And I know that may be a huge oversimplification, because I know there are situations with people who are in recovery and their spouses really hate it, but you have to look a little bit further as to what's really going on. Because what's happening there is on some level, that recovery is a threat. It's a threat to the status quo. And that's scary. And I think when you realize that someone's negative behavior is coming out of fear, or coming out of, you know, something that they don't understand or they don't know how to deal with, my mom, it's a good situation. I was able to just, instead of trying to get her to change her behavior, I started to look for and started to recognize what the need she was actually expressing by her behavior. And I went and very, not trying to be found out, not trying to be obvious, not trying to get any points for it, but just do those things. And I noticed that behavior just changed. Not because I was trying to get it to change, but because I was recognizing who I was dealing with, recognizing what they were need, and loving enough to be able to provide that. And I think there's something in that for someone who's in 12 step, who's in recovery, who has someone who is having a problem with that. You know, there's a need that may have been being met that isn't being met anymore, and trying to understand what that need is can probably be useful.
Andrew, the co-founder of Underearners Anonymous, talks about the program. It's to help people bring their soul out of hiding. And so I have some thoughts on how a 12-step program can help people bring their soul out of hiding. You get clarity in a 12-step program by working the 12 steps. And as you get clarity, you can let go of your misplaced guilt and shame. So looking at the promises, promise number 2, we will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. So as you enter the 12-step world, you learn that you don't have to beat yourself down for the embarrassing, stupid, and shameful things you've done in the past. You need to make amends, but you don't have to beat yourself down. So learning the spiritual process of the 12 steps, releasing that unnecessary guilt and shame, the misplaced guilt and shame, learning to get along with other people, learning where you end and other people begin. Al-Anon's particularly powerful for that, learning to track your time. But clarity creates energy and passion, which then provides the power to pursue your vision, and then being a part of a community and building relationships within a community that is dedicated to one single purpose, such as helping souls come out of hiding. Those are some of my thoughts on how a 12-step program such as Underearners Anonymous or Debtors Anonymous or Financial Underearners Anonymous can help a soul come out of hiding. Do you have any thoughts on how a 12-step program can help a soul come out of hiding?
I do. I'm kind of getting close to a break here where I need to.
Yep.
I'm going to need to go, but I think it's a good place to kind of wrap this up. I think it's a great place to wrap that up. So I'll, Andrew describes that, like, we go through life and we get traumatized. And very often we are, by our own behavior, positioning ourselves to be traumatized. And as a result of that, we withdraw from life and go into, what we perceive as a safe place. We call it the cave. And when someone tries to get into that cave, well, like a wounded animal, we snap at them, bite. When someone tries to get in that cave. Again, I go back to this idea of, we have a distorted survival/reward system. that is protecting us in inappropriate ways, that's protecting us very often from the very thing we need. And what 12-step has done in my experience is it's shown me what those things are. And more importantly, it's given me the tools to behave differently. You know, we will intuitively know how to handle things that used to baffle us. That's another one of the promises. And that's really important, because one of the reasons we get angry and we get frustrated is because we try to do things and it doesn't work and we don't know why. And so part of the process in 12-step is coming to understand how our self-centeredness, our self-seeking, our fear, our dishonesty, and our inconsideration, how those things create all kinds of crises and problems in our life that we then have to spend the energy to deal with. But when we recognize, A, that we are doing it, and B, what's driving it, and C, learning how to take a different course. You know, sometimes in 12-step we talk about taking contrary action. In other words, you know, you want to do this one thing, but we know that's not going to turn out really good. So you have to do the other thing. You have to do this completely 180-degree other thing. And it's a matter of training ourselves to do that, and training ourselves in the context of a community that supports that kind of training. That's what 12-step does. And, you know, some things happen very quickly. You know, some areas get relieved almost immediately. Some areas we don't even recognize they need to be relieved until much later on in the process, and then it may take some time for us to do that, and we have to be willing to spend the time. But that's really what it does. Again, to me, it's such a brilliant way to describe it. It's a new design for living that actually works, that is dependable, reliable, and produces all of the things that the promises describe.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for your time. I'll talk to you another time. So I'll let you go today, and I'll carry on solo for a little while. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you so much for the time. I really enjoyed this, and I hope we get to do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, take care, my friend. Bye-bye. Okay, so a lot of great resources online on YouTube for any of these issues if you want to learn more about them. So, for example, if you just put Debtors Anonymous into YouTube, you'll get all sorts of talks. If you put Unrunners Anonymous in there, you'll find talks like this one by Andrew. Let me play a little bit.
One thing, though, that in terms of debting, that my will was always screwing things up. I mean, I knew that. So, yeah, I don't want to hang on to my will. I'd rather turn that over to God. And I did understand experientially what a power greater than myself meant. I did know that when I went down on my knees and I did my serenity prayer, that I felt an arm, a hand on my shoulder. I did know how it felt to say, "Thy will be done," or "God, I'm turning this day over to you." Now, I don't even say I'm turning this day over to you. Now I'm saying, "God, please help me with this business today, if it would be your will to do so." I never say, "God, I want $500,000," or "God, I want my pony or my swimming pool," because then I'm telling God what God should do. So I don't do that. I say, "God, please help me with my business today, if it would be thy will to do so." Today, I woke up at 4:00 in the morning because I'm still on New York Times. I said, "God, please help me get back to sleep, if it would be your will to do so." And I did get back to sleep. So clearly this does work. The step 2 is about came to believe that a power greater than myself can restore me to sanity. In OA, sanity is abstaining from white flour, rice, sugar. In DA, solvency is about staying away from credit cards, unsecured loans, paying bills late. In AA, sanity is not drinking one day at a time. Is that right? Am I on track so far?
Okay, I want to go back to the promises, that the 12 steps promises. Page is 83, 84. The big book mentions these promises. So promise number 2 is we will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. So it was such a relief when my sponsor said, you don't have to beat yourself down for the shameful things that you did in your sex addiction, your love addiction, your dating addiction, your under-earning addiction, your addiction to unhealthy relationships. You don't need to be ashamed anymore. You did the best you could with what you had to meet your needs at the time. Now we're going to do a thorough moral inventory, and we're going to work step 9 where you make amends for the people that you hurt, but you don't have to beat yourself down anymore. And so you don't have to regret the past anymore, nor wish to shut the door on it. You can then with equanimity look back on the past, look at where you hurt other people, and then begin to clean up the wreckage. Promise number 3, we will comprehend the word serenity, which means to me being at ease with yourself, being at ease with other people, and being at ease with the God. We will know peace. Similar. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. So as you get marched through the 12 steps, you can pass that on to other people, and you can share what has been so generously given to you with other people. Promise number 6, that feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. So very early on in joining a 12-step program, there are all sorts of things that you can do. You can set up chairs. You can put together the coffee. You can help clean up. You can keep time. You can be the treasurer. There are all sorts of ways to be of service, and that's a wonderful, wonderful feeling. So some excitement in the chat about JF Gutter P talking about Milo Yiannopoulos' interview with Nick Fuentes. So let's have a look at JF here as he analyzes
your
this
current
interview.
views level. He had 2,000 viewers live in his premiere. So it's amazing that Milo is so disconnected from the world. It must be some sort of real life series of things that have disconnected him from his crowd, disconnected him from the internet, and he just doesn't know what's happening. All he knows is there's this guy, Nick Fuentes, who came out of nowhere. Nick Fuentes had less than 5,000 subscribers when I was inviting him on Blood Sports to make arguments about the USS Liberty against Halsey. Can you believe this?
Jews have too much power in the US, all this kind of stuff. It seems to me that, I think you know, the left creates the problems that it then likes to complain about. This is a sort of cycle they have with the think tanks. It seems to me that this is post me being ejected, Roger, Gavin, Laura, Alex Jones, when these people are scrubbed from society, and we're all like bonkers in our own way, but none of us are bigots, right? With all of us out, and our individual preoccupations, whether it's free speech, religion, or whatever, it seems to me that young people looking for answers are sliding into the easy one, which is race.
Unbelievable. This guy is such a narcissist that he believes that the cultural changes of America around race and Israel and all of these questions are the result of fucking Laura Loomer getting banned from Twitter. The guy thinks that there is a lack of Laura Loomer, that we are too deloomered, we are deprived of our Laura Loomer. And therefore we go into easy political solutions like thinking about scientific facts about genes, caring about the demographic futures of our country, and complaining against foreign aid to nations that have completely opposite interests to ours. That's because we're lacking the sight of the Laura Loomer boobs. They are not present in our face. We have been deprived of the tit of Mama Loomer. Do you realize how bad of a theory that is, and how much of a narcissist you have to be to come to this conclusion? Milo needs to take a break of in real life and start reconnecting with the internet. The ideological let me explain this to Milo, calmly. The ideological movement that you are perceiving in America has been caused intellectually as political movements develop frustration and disagreements with the mainstream media and the mainstream of politics. They have nothing to do with Laura Loomer. They have nothing to do with you to some extent. They have something to do with the interest of a people being robbed by a class of elite politicians who thought that they could get their votes while selling their interests to agents of other nations. And
okay, so that's just an excerpt there from JF Garapi's recent stream. So I just thought I'd express my appropriate gratitude to JF Garapi. He invited me on the Andy Warski show in late January of 2018, and it was such an invigorating, exciting experience that I've been live streaming pretty much every day since. And it was JF Garapi who invited me on that show. He was also a guest on my own show. He helped give me a great show, one of my most highly viewed shows. And I've been profoundly influenced by his video Sounding and Looking Pro on YouTube. And he also helped me out a little bit via Twitter DM with some audio problems that I was having. So want to tip my yarmulke and express my gratitude for the assistance that I've received from JF Garapi over the past couple of years. Of course, I disagree with him about plenty of things. Sometimes I think he hasn't read very carefully what he's discussing, but he frequently provides quality, thoughtful commentary. So I tip my yarmulke to JF. Okay, back to the promises. Promise 7, we will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Yeah. So I don't think it does any good to tell people, oh, you shouldn't be selfish, because I don't think people are selfish because they're choosing to be selfish, but when your basic needs aren't getting met, when you're in deep pain, you can't help but be selfish. So generally speaking, I think it does very little good to tell people not to be selfish. What they need is a program for getting their needs met, and this program will outline for them how they will get their needs met by being of service to other people. But just telling them don't be selfish, give of yourself, that's not going to cut it. So when I stepped into, I think, Debtors Anonymous, I immediately saw a way out of my financial problems. I saw a simple program. I saw a community. I made friends. I felt energized and inspired by the meetings, by the speakers, by the people who had similar problems to mine, and gained recovery. And so very quickly, I also then found opportunities to be of service, whether it was setting up before a meeting, putting things away after the meeting, donating a little bit of money every time I went to a meeting, just listening to people, taking outreach calls, giving outreach calls. And so when you join a 12-step program, and particularly when you gain a sponsor, they're going to make sure that you're being of service. And then the whole package starts working together. When you stop doing things your way, start taking good, orderly direction, you immediately get benefit. You immediately start feeling better. Your life starts working better. Your body language changes. The way you speak changes. The way you think changes, because you're not just repeating the same patterns that brought you to the problems in the first place. You're starting to head off in a new direction. As you head off in a new direction, you get happier. As you get happier, you naturally overflow with wanting to be of service to other people, to wanting to help others, and you start looking for those opportunities to be of service to others, and you want to give back because you start sponsoring and you start getting this spiritual charge, this energy, this inspiration. Through sponsoring, you start to see the world through new eyes as you guide people through the 12 steps, as you help to bring their souls out of hiding. It's incredibly exciting. And so there's a whole system for bringing souls out of hiding. And part of that system is allowing people to connect to a higher power, to connect to God, and then as you do that, you don't have to be so obsessed, so self-absorbed anymore, and your life starts to open up. So let me play more from another one of my favorite 12-step talks. This is Andrew, the founder of Under Earners Anonymous.
Hi, my name is Andrew, and I'd like to talk about repetitive under-earning patterns. For newcomers on the line, the name Under Earners Anonymous may imply that we are not making enough money, and by making enough money, then we're okay. And that is usually part of the truth, but never the whole truth. The word under-earning is also about under-deriving, under-gaining in life. And what we're really about within this fellowship is about not really getting enough out of life. And we really don't. I mean, that's the funny thing about it. Why? Because we are compulsive cave dwellers. So we choose to be in environments out of what we feel is safety that keep us protected. Well, why do we need to be protected? Because we're all wounded. We've all been through, in our family of origins, abuse and neglect. And as a result, we have a wound that we try to protect. And we're terrified that other people are going to sense that wound and attack us some more. And God knows what happens then. So that's why what UA is really about are people who have that wound and find a way to be visible in the communities and fields that they want to be, in a way of being willing to be helpful, willing to be of service within.
Okay, let me go back to the 12-step promises here. Promise number 8, self-seeking will slip away. Well, when do you find out how awesome it is to connect with God, to connect with other people, to be at ease with yourself, to be of service, even in small ways? Once this whole program starts working for you, then you find a whole new level of excitement and joy and passion in life, in living a life of service rather than just self-obsession. And so obviously I was a self-seeking whore prior to getting into 12-step, and I still have many of those same self-seeking whorish tendencies, but perhaps I've moved from like an 8 on a 1 to 10 of the narcissistic personality disorder to maybe a 6. And I asked Jen, Church of Entropy, how do we coax souls out of hiding? And she says the answer lies in engineering the dialect in such a manner so that coherent communication between people is optimized. Okay, so Jen's got a pretty solid following for her own ideas on coaxing souls out of hiding. She writes, you also have to appreciate that not everyone is ready to have the deep, important conversations, so you have to be patient to make them feel included so that when they are ready to contribute, they can contribute. Yes. Right, next promise. Promise number 9, our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Yeah, when you get clarity, all right, then you start rewiring your neural pathways. When you find benefit from developing new attitudes and new habits and developing new relationships, then the way you think, the way you speak, and the way you carry yourself will change. So being humiliated sucks. And when do we get humiliated? When we get out of touch with reality, when we start living in lies. So when we have an accurate understanding of our own abilities and of our own place in the universe, then we are much less likely to get humiliated. When you look at all these long threads on Kiwi farms and elsewhere on the internet about e-celebs that they find so obnoxious, it's almost always because the e-celeb is presenting a false image to the world. But when you try to be truthful, when you dedicate yourself to trying to live in truth and to have an accurate sense of your own importance, that doesn't mean thinking lowly of yourself, doesn't mean beating yourself down, just means understanding where you fall in the game of life. Like in this situation, it may be appropriate for you to take a leadership role, and in this other situation, it may be appropriate for you to take a service role. So there are areas of my life where I take a leadership role. I take a leadership role on my own channel, on my own shows. Then I do volunteering a few hours a week, and there I take a service role in one volunteer position, and in another volunteer position, I take a leadership role. Okay, promise number 10, fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. Yeah, so when we have an accurate sense of our own importance, when we have an accurate sense of where we fall in various hierarchies, then we have less reason to fear other people because they will have less reason to want to hurt us. And when we learn to get along with other people, then we will tend to be more prosperous and have far fewer reasons to fear economic insecurity. We will naturally tend to make more money. As we contribute more, there will be more opportunities for bringing in income, and so fear of economic insecurity will leave us. Also, as we develop a different relationship with ourselves, with God, with the universe, with other people, these fears will start to drop away.
Whatever community that is. I use the word community a lot because that's really what it's about. Community could be anything from a sound stage to a sewing circle to a factory floor to an office to a gallery. Could be the bridge of a ship. It could be, whatever. It could be air traffic control. But we're people who are afraid to be visible in that community. And because we have this wound in our bellies, and we're afraid that the other people or animals are going to sniff it out and rip out that wound and maybe even kill us. So that is why we compulsively under-earn, because the realities that we choose, we derive less from.
And Jen says in the chat, it's all about intention. If you have the intention to coax souls out of hiding, God will reveal how best to do that in time. And then Ashi wants me to play a clip here to get an analysis about the unconscious psychological mechanisms in society that elected Trump, according to his theory.
I would argue that President Trump is the result of death anxiety.
This is Sheldon Solomon.
Max Weber, a dead German sociologist at the beginning of the 20th century, he said that whenever the historical shit hits the fan, whenever there's a time in history where people are uncomfortable and uncertain, when that happens, we tend to become attracted to what he called charismatic leaders, larger-than-life people who often declare that God has chosen them to rid the world of evil. And what Ernest Becker said, that's because of death anxiety. When things are uncertain in the world, we become supportive of leaders who we might otherwise not find attractive at all. wall. We got interested in this right after September 11th, 2001. You guys look too young, but you might remember that George W. Bush was president at the time. Right before September 11th, he had one of the lowest approval ratings in the history of American politics. But 3 weeks later, he was one of the most popular presidents ever. We were wondering, we're like, oh, what happened? The president magically transformed from a functionally illiterate oil industry neocon meat puppet into an efficient public servant? Or were Americans so freaked out by the obvious reminders of death as a result of September 11th that they became attracted to the president, who, after all, said, I believe that God has chosen me to rid the world of the evildoers. And sure enough, we did a bunch of experiments in 2004 where we showed that Americans didn't care for President Bush or his policies in Iraq unless they were reminded of death first. They liked his policies and they liked him a lot. All right, so here we are in 2016. Donald Trump says, oh, I'm going to run for president. A lot of Americans, particularly ones that knew how to read, they were like, no, this is ridiculous. Obviously, he is no more fit to be president than he is to pilot the space shuttle or give birth to a live human child. That doesn't matter to his supporters. They were enthralled by his vow to make America great again by revitalizing the economy, building a giant wall, deporting 11 million immigrants, keeping Muslims out. It didn't matter one bit to them that 80% of everything that Trump says is demonstrably false. What matters is Americans, particularly those who are feeling threatened right now and economically and psychologically uncertain. Here's a charismatic leader who says, I am the only one who can keep you safe. Sure enough, we did experiments last summer where we showed that when people were in their right minds, when they were not reminded of death, they liked Hillary Clinton more than Donald Trump. But when they were reminded of death first, they liked Trump more than Clinton. Trump doesn't have to use the word death. He just has to keep saying terrorist, immigrant, and Muslim, which is every third word out of his face. I don't think it's a surprise that his rhetoric has not changed since he was elected. I would argue that he needs to keep people perpetually in a state of high death anxiety without them being aware of that fact, or else they may lapse into common sense and realize that he literally has very little intention of actually helping the people who, for the most part, were responsible for getting him elected. He was elected saying, I'm going to help the little people. But if you look at the folks that he has appointed to his cabinet, if you look at everything that he has done since he's been elected, the rich people will continue to get richer, while the planet within a few decades will no longer be habitable by humans.
Okay, I think much of that is ludicrous. For example, there's been a dramatic increase in wages for low-skilled workers under Trump. That's what naturally happens when you restrict immigration. But I think some of what he says made sense.
And I want to keep it that simple because you can spin the theoreticals and intellectual abstractions till the cows come home and then go back out to pasture. But just like Alcoholics Anonymous, which I'm a member of as well, and I have 2 years and 5 months sober. The issue of alcoholism is very simple. We drink to get out of self. We drink to not show up in life or deal with life on life's terms. Well, under-earning isn't that different. We under-earn. We under-earn to hide from life. Instead of hiding in a drink, we're hiding in a warehouse. Instead of hiding from a drink, we're hiding in miserable work that doesn't bring any of us out into the play of the fields or into reality. And if we are in that environment where we have instincts that we're putting out, we are either, as the meeting says, hiding or biting or lying or running or whatever it is, but we're not being useful. So I'm going to share a story that has a nice circular quality to it, and for the most part references what the moderator talked about in terms of repetitive patterns. When I was 16 years old, I was interested in studying acting. What does it mean that I was interested? It means that that's what my soul wanted to do. I also was interested in studying the guitar on a professional basis. Again, that's what my soul wanted to do. Both experiences totally zeroed out after I was given free instruction through Vocational Rehabilitation Center in New York. I studied with William Hickey, and I knew that the minute I got into the class, I really was in an environment that I didn't want to serve that community. I didn't want to meet with my action partner, with my scene partner. I didn't want to memorize the lines. I didn't want to be of service. But of course, I didn't know that I didn't want to be of service. All I knew is that I wanted to be in the class, but I really couldn't do the work that the class wanted me to do. Now, at the time, I was not taking drugs. I was not on medication. I was not having subauditory hallucinations. I was just a regular kid walking around who wanted to be in the acting class, but I really couldn't do any of the work. Why couldn't I do any of the work is because I was an under-earner. That was my first experience of being an under-earner, not being willing to show up and be visible in that class. At the same time, again, for instruction, I was given to study with Barry Galbraith, who was a guitar player from everybody from Lena Horne to Carly Simon. He was a studio guitarist. And I think he was at the time considered the best sight reader of any guitar player in New York. And I studied with him. What a privilege, right? But he would say, okay, study this music and go home and, what is he going to say? Go home, practice.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. Is recovery a way of claiming an identity the same way people with depression acknowledge that they are depressed, that they are depressives? So I remember in February 1988, I woke up with a really bad flu that didn't go away, and it just crippled my life. And for a year, my doctors had no answers of what was troubling me. And then I got in the mail an article from an Australian publication where my uncle had sent this to me, and the Australian publication named my symptoms and called them chronic fatigue syndrome. And I then took the article to my doctor, and the doctor said, yeah, that sounds about right. And it was such a relief to have a diagnosis, to have a name, to start to have a way of trying to understand what was happening to me. So clarity, in my experience, brings energy. The power to name something, to accurately name something, is phenomenal. It gives you power, it gives you energy, it gives you strength, motivation, and clarity. When you have clarity, you will be more at ease with yourself, with other people, with the universe. So I have always found tremendous relief with clarity, and clarity has always assisted my life. And part of clarity is accurately naming things. So I am not wedded to the terms like sex addict, gambling addict, compulsive financial under-earner, debting addict. But I've seen these terms, these concepts, and these programs be incredibly useful to me and to a lot of other people. And so I find there's power in this approach. And so I never spend time like debating whether these addictions are real addictions like alcoholism or anything like that. I don't debate that. I just find use in these approaches, in these understandings. Like on the face of it, saying that someone who's addicted to debting, addicted to online shopping has a disease, yeah, I understand that sounds ridiculous. But what are the consequences? So for about 2 years, I went to Kundalini Yoga almost every day. And many of the things that I was taught in Kundalini Yoga just seemed bizarre, like way beyond my own comprehension, if not downright irrational or even sometimes dangerous. But overall, I got great benefit from going to Kundalini Yoga every day. I got a hot girlfriend for a year. I enjoyed it. It was a holy place. It was good for me physically. It was good for me spiritually. I made friends. It was a new community. I appreciated my 2 years in Kundalini Yoga. And that was completely without respect to whether or not the things that I was taught there had ultimate validity. So some things I think you can pursue them and use their terminology if it has pragmatic value in your life. And you don't have to necessarily debate it.
Access these 5 pages and come back next week. And I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. The energy for it just cut off. Now, to keep it really simple, again, for the beginners, the lowest bottom of this disease is what happened to me. The energy for those 2 specific types of prosperity shut off like a light switch, and it was just gone. That happened to me over the next 35 years. Again and again and again. It didn't matter what it was. Because this disease does not allow us to be visible. And what I mean by us is the instincts and talents that we have in us, which are organic. Hold on a second. There we go. Organic meaning of us. So my instinct was to be a musician. My instinct was to be an actor. There was no way I was able to allow myself to do that. It happened to me when
So there's some commentary in the chat about Yogi Bhajan, the founder of the 3HO movement, Happy, Healthy, Holy, otherwise known as Kundalini Yoga. And so when I got into Kundalini Yoga, within a couple of months, I read all these like bitter, angry recollections of people who'd been in the movement in an intense way and then come to realize that it was spiritually destructive, socially destructive, physically destructive. So I read all their perspectives and I appreciated that. So just like I found some benefit from reading Tony Robbins, listening to some of his tapes, at the same time, I then spent time reading critiques of Tony Robbins. So I enjoyed going to Kundalini Yoga, but I spent many, many hours reading critiques of Kundalini Yoga by people who are much more deeply involved in Kundalini Yoga than I was ever going to be. And I didn't need to make a decision. I got to the place very quickly where I did not do, say, half of the procedures that were typically given in a class because I thought they were destructive for me and for my body and for where I was at in life. I think, generally speaking, Westerners probably not really cut out for yoga. It's probably going to be dangerous for many people. I did thousands of dollars of permanent physical damage to myself in my early enthusiasm for Kundalini Yoga. I was spending all that money on physical therapy to try to repair the damage that I'd done by going to these Kundalini Yoga classes. So very quickly, I pulled back about half the procedures that the teachers would say. I would just not practice. And so I used Kundalini Yoga in a way that benefited me, and I stopped doing things that were destructive to my body.
I was doing stand-up comedy. I literally would never want to build an act, and I would just go in from one open mic to the next, and I would riff and do material that other comedians thought was very funny, but there was no way that it was commercially viable. And I didn't think about, okay, I want to be a professional comedian. Let me build my first 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever. I didn't do that. I didn't have that idea of, because again, that would have been even more visibility to actually go out and do this for a living. So that didn't happen when I and what did I do? I mean, most of what I did for a living was outside sales. Was like, and I remember at one point I had an interview with this guy to sell Xerox copiers, which would have been financially far more viable than what I was doing, but I was absolutely terrified to do it. I said, what do you want me to? Because I would be with other salespeople. So at the time, I was actually selling really like grade C greeting cards, like grade B greeting cards, and stuff that was like, not the, that you could fill it in with. So it resulted with me running around trying to get little orders and barely surviving. And I did that for years. And I didn't know why I did it. I just did. So it was one of those things. So getting back to this whole acting thing. So I would go to acting class on and off for about, probably 8 years. And again, the same thing would happen over and over again. There was no spiritual basis of wanting to be visible. So I had no idea that was the monkey on my back. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Israel, and I went to the Wailing Wall, and I said, God, what is your will for me? What work do you want me to do for the rest of the remaining time I have on this planet? And the answer was entertain. The word just entertain came into my head, which sort of makes sense because that's what I love doing. I love making people laugh. And, when you make someone laugh, you're giving them a vacation. And I didn't say that. Winston Churchill did. But it's really true. And you know the thing that we're
10 minutes.
Is that 10 minutes? Well, one of the reasons why this is a 12-step fellowship is because it is a spiritual. It's just a spiritual process. So when I was in Jerusalem, I heard the voice entertain. It wasn't my voice. It was either God's voice or from the universe or whatever it was, but it was certainly not mine. And I came back, and there was this theater in Nyack here. And I have passed by this theater for 11 years, and I never once prepared for any audition. So this time I saw that they were casting a play called The Real Inspector Hound, and I went home and I went to the library and I got the play out of the library.
And to cut a long story short, there he finally prepared, and then he had a lot more success when he prepared. Okay, this is Nancy Pelosi at a town hall.
Speaker Pelosi, you resisted calls for the impeachment of President Bush in 2006 and President Trump following the Mueller report earlier this year. This time is different. Why did you oppose impeachment in the past? And what is your obligation to protect our democracy from the actions of our president now?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the question about, because when I became Speaker the first time, there was overwhelming call for me to impeach President Bush on the strength of the war in Iraq, which I vehemently opposed. And again, I said at other places, that was my wheelhouse. I was intelligence. I was a ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, even before I became part of the leadership of Gang of Four. So I knew there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. It just wasn't there. They had to show us, they had to show the Gang of Four all the intelligence they had. The intelligence did not show that that was the case. So I knew it was a misrepresentation to the public. But having said that, it was in my view, not a ground for impeachment. They won the election, they made a representation, and to this day, people think that it was the right thing to do. The people think that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. I mean, it's appalling what they did. But I did, and I said, if somebody wants to make a case, you bring it forward. But they had impeached Bill Clinton for personal indiscretion and misrepresenting about it. Impeached him. Some of these same people are saying, oh, this doesn't rise to impeachment. We're right there impeaching Bill Clinton for being stupid in terms of something like that. I mean, I love him. I think he was a great president. But being stupid in terms of that, and what would somebody do not to embarrass their family? But in any event, and that's so they did. Bill Clinton, now they want me to do George. I just didn't want it to be a way of life in our country. As far as the Mueller report, there was a good deal of, the academics said, and 1,000 legal experts wrote a statement that said the Mueller report is an what's in there is an impeachable offense. It wasn't so much of what's in the Mueller report will be more clear once some of the court cases are resolved, but it wasn't so clear to the public. The Ukraine just removed all doubt. It was self-evident that the president undermined our national security, jeopardized the integrity of our elections as he violated his oath of office. There's just, that's something that cannot be ignored.
Okay, that's Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Okay, Richard Spencer's got a long thread here. Recently, there's been renewed debate about banning porn, which I welcome. Spoiler, I support an outright ban. It's important to properly define what's at stake in this controversy so as not to descend into confusion, meaningless status signaling, or Islamic-like nihilism. My position, I guess, will be kind of vague in general. I think no society can afford not to regulate porn in some way, not to restrict it in some ways. Exactly where you should draw the limits, I don't have a position, but I think civilization depends upon regulating, restricting, and limiting access to pornography. Richard writes, I'm not against erotic art. Indeed, I lament the fact that the world has become less sensual and colorful and more rigid and lifeless. The fundamental problem with porn isn't exactly the graphic photorealist depiction of sex, though that is an indispensable part of it. Problem with porn is that erotica of the past acted as an aphrodisiac, that is, it inspired sexuality, it was life-affirming, whereas porn is a sex substitute. Porn doesn't cause rape, as many critics suggest. If anything, it prevents rape, it prevents sex altogether. I agree with that sentiment. How many couples watch porn to spice up their sex life? My guess is that this porn viewing demographic is quite small. I agree. Overwhelmingly, porn is consumed alone by men and women who masturbate and who are not engaging in sex, not to mention marriage, child rearing, etc. I disagree that it's overwhelmingly consumed by men who can't get women. Overwhelmingly, men are not giving up access to sex. They're solitary and they are consuming porn. Obviously, we've all watched porn on the internet. I'm not sure that we've all done that. I'm sure Richard has, and he said elsewhere that he feels like he's watched way too much porn and watches currently too much porn. Some it amounts to a dalliance, for others a debilitating addiction, even those engaged in a relationship. I agree with that. For some people, it's highly destructive. For other people, the destructive side of using porn is not obvious. But I'm trying to get at the fundamental problem of porn, and that's bigger than its malign side effects. Modern porn is hyper-reality. Porn sex is even better than the real thing. The viewer doesn't just get a glimpse of tits and ass, he experiences sex in high definition in the coming year increasingly through virtual augmented reality in 3D. The hyper-real sex life of your average porn viewer is something out of Don Juan's or James Bond's wildest fantasies, or rather nightmares, bizarre and fetishistic, quasi-illegal, inflicting bodily damage, breaking every taboo, including increasingly incest. Why would your average incel loser bother taking a girl on a date? Not to mention courting her for marriage, when he can instantly experience an insane bukkake gangbang at the click of a button. Vanilla lovemaking in real life doesn't compare to the extreme experiences he gets online. Porn doesn't inspire sex, to the contrary, it institutes abstinence and loneliness and ultimately leads to the end of human life, not the heat death of the universe. Yes, the stakes are this high. Porn isn't properly understood as deviant, decadent, or subversive. To the contrary, it is puritanical and a form of social control. It weakens men and women and saps them of energy. It is anti-erotic. Modern porn gives us a glimpse of a world in which, like the Cartesian brain in a jar, humans are segregated into pods, given VR stimulation and used as batteries, all the while enjoying their simulacrum of vitality. The proper corollary to any movement that seeks to ban porn is to legalize prostitution. Yes, prostitution brings with it problems, but prostitution is, after all, the real thing, not a virtual thing. It offers a human experience, not a hyper-real lie. Prostitution that is overseen by the government can be reasonably safe, and legal regulated prostitution would no doubt reduce the brutal human trafficking and sex slavery that defines the practice today. Legalizing prostitution would be a recognition of the fallen nature of man. Man will always seek erotic experience. The question is, what will this be? Life-denying hyper-reality or a flawed but forgivable dalliance in debauchery? To ask the question properly is to answer it. So my point of view is that for most people, I've come to understand, they define what is moral by what is legal. So when you make prostitution legal for a large part of the population, probably the majority of the population, they will then understand prostitution as moral, as effectively moral. And therefore, thousands and thousands of people who would not otherwise engage in that profession will engage in it if it becomes above board and legal. So I don't have a particular position on where you draw the line and how much resources you should pour into combating prostitution, but I see an enormous downside to legalizing prostitution. I'm sure there are also upsides, but the downside is, for most people, what is legal equals what is moral. And that goes for pornography as well. When you ask pornographers about the morality of working in the pornography industry, their primary answer is, well, it's legal.
And I read the play. Gee, what a revelation. I actually read the play. In fact, I didn't read it once. I read it like about 4 or 5 times. And I spent afternoons in the library looking up French words and looking at the meaning and looking at videos and talking to my actors friends about motivation and what the character wants. And I was reading my Larry Moss book. And I was doing my best, but I did everything I could do to prepare for this thing. So I go to the audition. And, 2 things before the audition. One, I said I'm a brilliant actor to the degree that I am. I use that affirmation for everything. It's very important because all I'm saying is that I'm brilliant I'm brilliant at whatever it is that I'm doing right here and right now to the degree that I am. And the reason why I say that is because the diseased part of my brain can't counter that. It's too complex a construction.
Okay, that's an interesting thought. Okay, I want to play Chuck Todd talking to Ted Cruz.
Russia interfered in our election. Chuck, let me point out a game that the media is playing. A question that you've asked a number of people is you've said to senators sort of aghast, do you believe that Ukraine and not Russia interfered in the election? Now that in a court of law would be struck as a misleading question. Of course Russia interfered in our election. Nobody looking at the evidence disputes that.
But the President of the United States does.
Look, on the evidence, Russia clearly interfered in our election. But here's the game the media is playing. Because Russia interfered, the media pretends nobody else did. Ukraine blatantly interfered in our election. The sitting ambassador from Ukraine wrote an op-ed blasting Donald Trump during the election season.
Do you know why he did that?
That is unusual.
What did Donald Trump as a candidate say about Ukraine and Crimea during the election that might have inspired the ambassador?
So you're saying they had disagreements with Donald Trump and they wanted Hillary Clinton to get elected.
Okay, so they wrote an op-ed.
A Ukrainian parliamentarian.
That is the difference. What you're saying is you're saying a pickpocket, which essentially is a Hill op-ed, compared to Bernie Madoff and Vladimir Putin. You're trying to make them both seem equal. I don't understand that.
Chuck, I understand that you want to dismiss Ukrainian interference because A, they were trying to get Hillary Clinton elected, which is what the vast majority of the media wanted anyway, and B, it's inconvenient for the narrative. It's hysterical. 2 years ago, there was article after article after article in the mainstream media about Ukrainian interference in the elections. But now the Democrats have no evidence of a crime, no evidence of violating the law. And so suddenly Ukrainian interference is treated as the media clutches their pearls. Oh, my goodness, you can't say that. Last week, Chuck, you called Senator John Kennedy basically a stooge for Putin.
I did not.
The press needs to stop being ridiculous, Senator, and acting like they work for Adam Schiff.
Okay, so did you get the briefing from the intel community?
Okay, so Steve Saylor's favorite politician, or it seems that the politician he has the most respect for and interest in, is Ted Cruz. So here's another thread. This is a Twitter video on someone ripped that Maurizio Catalan banana off the wall at Art Basel and ate it. So let's have a look.
Yep. Art performance. What? Art performance. Hungry artist.
I think this art was valued at $120,000.
We respect Mauricio, but it's art performance, hungry artist. To the gallery. Thank you, very good. You have more? 150,000? That's been good. Oops. Too much tape. Art performance.
Okay, here is Boris Johnson, a clip of him from 2013.
Impatient and globalized economy in which the competition is getting ever stiffer. And no one can ignore the harshness of that competition or the inequality that it inevitably accentuates. And I'm afraid that violent economic centrifuge is operating on human beings who are already very far from equal in raw ability, if not in spiritual worth. Whatever you may think of the value of IQ tests, it is surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85, while about 2%, anyway, 16%, what do you want to put up your hands? 16% have an IQ below 85, 2% have an IQ above 130. And the harder you shake the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top. And for one reason or another, boardroom greed, or as the people in the boardrooms assure me, the natural and God-given talents of senior executives, the income gap between the top cornflakes and the bottom cornflakes is getting wider than ever. And I stress, I don't believe that economic equality is possible. Indeed, some measure of inequality is essential for the spirit of envy and keeping up with the Joneses and so on.
Okay, that's excellent stuff there from Boris Johnson. And funny tweet here. Or GOP truth passes through 3 stages. First, from Nick Fuentes, it is ridiculed. Second, on Tucker Carlson, it is violently opposed. Third, on Sean Hannity, it is accepted as being self-evident.
So I'm always able to say that affirmation with peace. And again, it's like saying I'm brilliant at. You could be I'm a brilliant writer to the degree that I am. I'm a brilliant script memorizer to the degree that I am. It's a very positive affirmation, and it's in fact true. The other thing that I did was I prayed for the willingness to be of service. I knew that I'd be afraid going to that audition. I knew that I would want to run out of there, and I felt sort of nauseous being there. And I knew that was from fear. I mean, it was. I mean, it's like no, there was nothing new about that. But I did audition. I read with the assistant director, and they said we may ask you back for a callback. I said okay, and I was prepared to either get the part or not get the part. I would live either way. So the next day, I get a call back to go back and read different scenes of different characters. And I did that, and I think I did a pretty good job. But again, before the audition, I prayed again for the willingness to be of service. Prayed for the willingness to be of service to that community, because that community, it doesn't matter whether it's an audition for Game of Thrones or for the Real Inspector Hound at the Elmwood Theater in Nyack.